But anyway, this is just one example of how we really are conceptual in the way that we approach our students' learning and assessment.
I think that
We're
we'll,
short, so.
yeah, I'll just quickly mention that this is a huge focus for us this year. This is the momentum of the programs has grown to the point where the teachers are seeing the benefits of this as a best practice for assessment in terms of standards-based grading. So this slide shows what it is in terms of focusing on more of the process of learning, progress towards mastery of criteria and standards versus a one-and-done assessment where you've shown your understanding or you haven't and you move on to the next thing. So over the course of the year, the students will be measured against 4 criteria in each subject group and will have the opportunity to reflect on how they did on any given assessment, look at the descriptors for the next steps, set their own goals for learning and to continue that progress towards mastery. We have a cohort of 42 teachers at the middle school and the high school who are implementing this this year. After tomorrow, they will have been through 2 days of training during their summer to wrap their heads around what this is going to look like for their classes and to prepare for the communication piece to parents and to dive in to this practice for the students, because we have decided as a community that we really do believe this is through articles, through books that they've read. They've all read the same book and a trip to a school, seeing the benefits that this has for students. They're ready to dive in and see how they can better support student growth through this practice.
All right, thank you. I'm going to, excellent information. I'm going to transition us just a little bit, and I want to use the standards-based grading as an example, because what we know with standards-based grading is that IB schools across the world are using standards-based grading. Those IB schools that are the premier schools in the world. And I want to just say this, and I think it's probably for another time, but it also does sort of relate to a governance issue, because as you start to talk about standards-based grading, so on a continuum from 1 to 8 or 1 to 7, as opposed to A, B, C, D, F, there is a lot of, confusion if it's not communicated well. It can be a cultural shift that can be complicated for people that are not familiar with that. And then it begins to get into questions like, well, how does this impact college applications, college acceptance rates, and the like? And I will just say this just to say it, and then I want to try to generate a little bit of a list here, is that we've had a chance to talk to the admissions specialists at the University of Virginia, Virginia Tech, William and Mary, and George Mason, and all of them have said, we see kids from IB schools that don't use A through F all the time, and we know exactly what they look like. And oh, by the way, we know George Mason, and the students from George Mason come to us always well prepared. So we have opportunity to really begin to get at sort of the full experience of IB by engaging in practices that are consistent with IB. But those do tend to then get at some of those cultural issues. So I want to invite the principals, along with our IB coordinators and the board, to help us think about and kind of put a quick list together of what do we see as IB practices. You can hear me okay, right? IB practices that are considered best practices that we have in place currently, and then some of those IB practices that are best practices that we don't currently have in place. And so we started to identify, just while everyone was talking, current best practices are, we have a continuum, right? We're a continuum division. We're PYP, MYP, DP. But related to that, what's not best practice is we don't have the career-related program that's associated to make us a full continuum. So you see the 4 circles on the continuum of IB, and we're actually only 3 of the 4. So we're missing the career-related program. Current best practices, we have approaches to learning that are utilized by many of our teachers. But the antithesis of that is that we have approaches to learning that are being used, but maybe not by all teachers, right? And that's just it's something that is not currently happening. We have standards-based grading, which is a best practice that isn't currently in place. So what are some of those other best practices? And again, I want to invite the principals to be part of this conversation too, along with the IB coordinators and staff and the board. What are some of those best practices that are currently not in place that if we had them in place would truly make us a premier IB school division? Greg.
And I'll build on that a little bit just to invite my colleagues on the board as we're in this conversation. If we're hearing things that are not necessarily things that we ourselves need to do, what are the preconditions that we need to have in our governance to help facilitate those activities? What do we need to be doing in our board role to make the path smoother for those other implementation activities? But that's just another thought to add on to.
Yeah.
If I can kick off one thing, I think one thing that would really help is time for more vertical articulation from PYP to NYP to DP. I know a couple years ago we did a learning walk. We had selected teachers go down and visit the elementary schools and Mary Ellen Henderson, and it was very revealing and a wonderful experience to see the standards and practices, the inquiry-based approach to learning occurring at all levels. And it's eye-opening, I think, for the DP teachers to see it happening throughout the continuum. But time and money to get more vertical understanding and articulation is something I would like to see happen.
And to add to that, I mean, time is the word that comes up, right, in education for teachers. But also not just going from school to school, but that having that time to sit and plan that vertical alignment also means being able to have the time to get their unit plans together within each program, within each department. So several staff do come in over the summer to work on their units when they can. And then we have department time, and there is time built into the week for collaborative planning time as well. But to build a unit plan for the PYP or the MYP, truly from top to bottom can take 10 to 15 hours. And a lot of it happens while they're teaching, so they'll establish the purpose, and then the day-to-day activities can be discussed in that CT time and in the department time also shared. But to really sit down, writing a statement of inquiry or a central idea alone can take 30 minutes of collaborative time. So just to think about the amount of time it takes to actually put our values and our beliefs in how we're going to approach teaching and approach learning onto paper just takes the time.
What else?
I heard Alicia say that we don't have the early years program yet in place at JTP. I wonder if that's the piece of bridging all of our schools together, getting Jesse Thackeray in that. Yeah, career related, yeah.
When I think about best practices, I think about best practices.
Use a mic,
Talking
guys.
something?
All right, yeah. Thanks. When I think about best practices, I think about best practices across the board. So you've said this often, Dr. Noonan, we should not have a teacher lottery system. And everything we described today talks about the consistency in terms of instruction, in terms of from one teacher to another, whether it's with the units, whether it's with how we instruct. And that's an important piece. We want our kids to have a very unique experience, but we don't want one student to get something another student does not have the opportunity to have. And I think that's an important piece. So we want to get to that point where it's common practices across the board, whether it's common assessments, unit planners, you name it. And I think that's an important piece.
One thing that we've talked about in a variety of of formats, and it sort of goes both for the board and for the work of the division, is communication. I'm thinking about the standard-based assessment and the amount of communication that we really need to make sure we're having with the community about what does this mean for all of the questions, Dr. Noonan, that you brought up, but also what are we doing for ourselves in assessing, and just picking up on what you were saying earlier, Justin, what are we doing for ourselves on assessing our performance and communicating how we do that, and communicating that we're keeping aware of all of the things where our work of governance kind of makes it easier for the work to go forward. It makes it easier for those communications, even if we aren't the ones actually saying it out loud. What do we do about that? So I think a best practice there is to make sure that we're continually, I think we do it to some degree, trying to be consistent with communication, but we can always get better at it. And I think the other one is to make sure that we're continuing our own professional development as board members and as a board together.
Continuing with the communication piece, as we roll out standards-based grading, the communication to the community and to the parents is vital, and we've received some parent input that we simply can't over-communicate at this stage. The amount of information that they need to help understand so that they can support their children at home through this shift is vital. And so what we're going to be looking for is opportunities to provide parent information sessions scattered throughout the fall, definitely, and probably into the spring. So having the opportunity to meet with parents at times that work for them as well, in order to help with that communication piece.
All right, I'm gonna stop us there. And what I'd like to do is are you guys good on time? Or do you have to- you good on time? Carrie?
We're here.
We're here.
Softball practice is over.
It's over.
And principals, are you good on time? Okay. I wanna take just 10 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes. And I'd like to take some of these best practices that are currently not in place. And I want to have 2 school board members, 1 IB coordinator, and a principal or 2 to talk about